All right, cool. Cool. So Jensen, we were just talking a little bit about process at which growth uses. I pointed out that the rest of GitLab has to commit to things on a monthly basis, and then we actually have a kickoff. And I was asking does the growth group have to actually operate that way? Can we do something that's more agile? Do we actually have to announce things and commit to releases? And you were providing some thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just in thinking about the process, I think there's two major items that are going to influence how the growth team operates. And I don't necessarily think it fits into the paradigm of the release cycles that the company is talking about now, but that can still be decided. One is these tests are almost necessarily going to be a little bit more holistic and a little bit larger than some of the iterations of the fulfillment team or any of those other teams. Because if you think about, let's say, onboarding onto a stage, we can onboard someone onto a single stage, but what's almost going to be worth testing is if we create an onboarding flow for multiple stages, does that create a user who is using more stages at once? So again, some of these tests I think are going to be a little bit larger in scope. The other thing is, if we want to create something where we're actually able to test on self-hosted, we're going to need to create an infrastructure that allows us to create cycle dynamic code into self-hosted instances and do tests in self-hosted instances. But that's point one. Point two is we're going to have 4 different groups within growth. I don't necessarily know if I see a path towards being able to iterate on a test for each of these groups at the same time. How is activation going to be running an A/B test, and upsell going to be running an A/B test at the same time, and those results aren't going to be muddled, right? So it's kind of not only will our schedule be our release schedule be influenced by the size of each project, but also how we schedule these tests based on whether or not they conflict with each other. We might be able to run 4 tests at once, but that's highly doubtful. And whenever we look at the analysis, we're going to be okay, well, which A/B group was this in for the upsell test versus the activation test, right? So it's going to be really hard when those tests start conflicting. And our release schedule might actually be okay, we have code to run a test with, but we're scheduling that test to be run in a month or 2 months or whatever. And so that's kind of what's hard for me to think about.
Yeah, so I agree with you. And one comment that I had in the product channel in the growth channel was that we need to measure the velocity of the teams themselves, and the ultimate one metric that matters is how many tests are we running per month, and we need that to move up and to the right. And one of the major barriers for that to happen is that if we are constantly kind of waiting for a monthly release to go out so that we can test on self-managed, it's gonna be a real challenge for us to maintain a high velocity. We're on GitLab.com, we're deploying every week. So our rate of experiment, the windows that we can ship an experiment are 4 per month. So that's pretty good. I mean, we can actually work with that. And in that model, it doesn't matter if we're committing to things in a milestone and different milestones, or spending time estimating issues or whatever. In that model, we can just create a Kanban board, just pull stuff off, people work on that, ship the experiment, get it done, without thinking about some of the data analysis problems that you talked about, which are certainly valid. So I agree with you. That's one thing that I've been struggling with, which is can we come up with a way for us to be able to ship experiments more aggressively towards self-managed? And like you said, maybe I think that there probably is an option for a labs type feature for self-managed. People could opt into it and then allow some of this code to be dynamically shifted into the application itself. I think that would be kind of really, really interesting and compelling. But I think the model that we need, that we might, if we do start with a model that's we're going to commit to things in a month, will like commit to like delivering like X number of experiments in like a particular like month or release cycle. I think we need to move past that and figure out how we can actually like move to a continuous deployment kind of model.
Yeah.
So I agree with that. I think that the point that you brought up about A/B testing is a good one. I think it really depends on like the tests that we're running. Like in other companies that I've been at, we've shipped a bunch of stuff all at the same time and A/B tested, dozens of things at once with the knowledge that like we're doing it completely randomly and we have such a large like audience that whatever kind of whatever confounding factors that there are going to be basically equal in whatever variance that we have. So the assumption is that we can compare cleanly across segments. That might not always be the case. Yeah. Like if we have an A/B test that's focused on like a very, very small like audience and like tracks them over a long period of time, then like that is something that could cause problems. So yeah. I think that's just like we need to keep that in mind for the longer term A/B tool tests that we decide to invest in, which is like we need to be able to segment both randomly and maybe like create more specific segments that allow us to say like, okay, we're going to divide our entire population into 4 buckets. We're going to give a control and variant to this half, and then we're going to give a control and variant to this half. And you just have that as part of our experiment design. So that's my thought. I think that I totally agree. I think that like for us to be able to ship effectively and quickly, we need to like solve this problem. But if we have to live with it for a month or 2, I think it's fine. But I think that's a problem we have to solve longer term.
Yeah, I agree. The only caveat to that is I think that we're necessarily making an assumption that we can do all these tests on .com and that they will translate to self-serve. Because we can't really do an A/B test that conflicts like that and make a decision with self-hosted clients since like you're going to have to make a statistical decision based off of each instance, right? And based off of the number of users in each instance. So it's going to be a little bit harder to do that analysis. So let's just walk through an example. Let's say we're testing new onboarding flow for self-hosted or for everyone, even doesn't matter. We launch to self-hosted, that starts getting downloaded and in the upgrade process, and now a bunch of users are using it at Zillow, right, which is a huge company. We can get some insight into how those users are, how successful they are on the new onboarding flow. Then some other small company, some startup who has a self-hosted instance does the same thing. It's going to take longer to see those users move through that process because they're not necessarily going through that onboarding flow at the same rate. Sure. So I mean, we can combine those things, but I guess what I mean is like it's going to take quite some time because we have to get to a certain number of users, a certain number of instances that are downloaded in the upgrade process, and then make a decision based on a statistical analysis that combines all of these things and makes a little bit of assumption as to like, okay, smaller users are the same as big users, because in that case, if we did that analysis, then Zillow would completely overwhelm the data from some of those smaller users. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. So a couple of thoughts. Like I agree with what you're saying, and I think we're going to have that problem with like GitLab.com too, which is like we have this overwhelming audience of free users, and to be perfectly frank, like the business value of like our paid user base, which is like 1% of GitLab.com. I'm really interested in knowing like how that experience is going to differ and like how that user base reacts. Maybe we have the ability to have 2 different types of user experiences that we shift to 2 different segments of the population. I haven't thought about that but I mean that same problem will exist on .com as well, which is like we have this over like different segments of like users and like on EE, and then like we need to be able to factor in like and not make it so that like a massive like data point from a single large instance is going to wash out everyone else. So that's fine. I agree with what you're saying that like the length and timeline of our analysis is going to be super long if we can say we're going to ship like onboarding tomorrow for .com, and then we're going to get a bunch of data. But actually, we have to wait until August 22nd before we're actually able to ship to self-managed, and then we have to wait, 2 weeks for everyone to upgrade, and then we have to wait another week for actually everyone to like experience it, and then we might get a little bit of data back. So maybe there's separate tracks for like self-managed and .com where like we can say like .com, we have confidence in this, we're going to fix the variant for this and make a decision. For self-managed, we're going to let that experiment run a little bit longer until we can get in the confidence it's the same thing. I don't know if user behavior differs from like .com and self-managed,
Right.
but at least that'll start the conversation. I don't know. It's a great point though.
Yeah. And that's what I've been thinking, that I think just speaking to like projects outside of the scope of this release process, it makes sense for onboarding and adoption to create a piece of code that is dynamically updated.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning like, there's a bunch of companies that create onboarding flows. Like you can create an onboarding flow and it just basically overlays against your website. That's what I'm thinking that we should create, so that when we run a test, we can run it across all instances, both .com and self-serve, or we can split it. We can separate it if we want to, but it's like immediate because we go, this test should be run right now.
Right.
And it updates that dynamic code that gets downloaded. So when a user onboards, it's like updating that dynamically. And the new onboarding flow lends itself super well to that. We just need to split it off and make it dynamic, because all it's really doing is just overlaying, creating like click here, do this, whatever. But we could also do that for stage adoption, because each stage is going to need that same walkthrough. I almost think that's worth investing in upfront, so that we can be like, okay, now we have the ability to run tests and create analyses across all these instances, and we don't have to worry about this set of problems. I mean, that's not necessarily true on the first time we release this, because we would still have that probably long tail. But anytime we release it after that, we can be like, all right, well, here you go. All self-hosted instances. But I don't know the appetite security-wise for downloading dynamic code to self-hosted instances. But
I think they'll definitely have some comments and some thoughts.
Yeah.
But no, I agree with you. I think that there's like maybe I think that this is a problem that we need to solve, and we need to. Obviously, there's some things that we won't be able to do, like injecting like a new container and or presenting like a banner to like some instances is different than like we're going to build a new feature and you have to do a bunch of migrations, and like it's like there's going to be a ton of backend work to. But I mean, things like onboarding, I think, lend themselves fine to this approach. Yeah. And at least we should be able to unblock it, because like we just talked through, like that whole like workflow of like, let's ship to .com next week, but then we're going to have to wait 45 days before we actually can do the same analysis in self-managed. It's going to either make it so that we're ignoring self-managed, or we are like taking 60 days to make any kind of decision on any experiment. And I don't think that either of those is acceptable. So
I think 60 days is even a little bit concerned. Like you're being a little positive. I actually think.
Oh, that's for like registration, top of funnel. If you go any deeper than that, if you go to like payments or like something deeper in, then you're talking like it's 4 or 5 months or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, cool. So how can I help? Like let me just end this call. I know we're a little over with like that. Like I know there's like a bunch of problems that are on your mind. How can I help? Like I talked about, like I'm going to focus on opening some of these handbook updates to hopefully like write down some of these things so we can like change that. But what else can I help with?
I really want to see what the appetite is to make a larger investment up front to be able to solve some of these problems. Because I don't have a good sense for, number one, like how to even talk about something like this. I can create an issue, but this is really like going to be a central problem, I think, for growth that we could solve right now. But it's not even just for growth. It's like we can make a much larger impact and much faster if we do this. So there's for sure an argument to be had that this makes sense in investing in. I just don't know how to go about like starting the conversation of being like, number one, I think this is important, and number two, I'd like to go around the release process to think about how we can accomplish this.
Just write it down as an issue and just start it in the growth project. I will share this with you. Like, it took me a while to get to a low level of shame, but just like write stuff down, even if it's like totally, I'll show you like an embarrassing issue that I'm working on right now. There's like a problem on Manage that I'm trying to figure out, which is like, enterprises typically run into problems around groups, like using groups for like their enterprise activity. And there's a bunch of, different challenges that are associated with that. But my thinking there is like, we need to move to something called like a workspace, which is like a namespace for like all of your enterprise activity to live into. You create a user in that workspace, you create a group in that workspace, it all stays isolated there. My proposal is nothing, and my questions to answer are nothing right now. But it like starts the conversation with like my engineering manager and other product managers. So like just start by like writing down the problem and saying like, here's the problem. Here's the things that we could do. Start like a labs feature, bullet point, and then like we can start talking about it and collaborating. So I just start with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we'll do. I'm gonna create that issue today.
Yeah, sounds good, man. So like I know that like feedback has been on your mind a little bit too, around like the feedback prompt and like getting more qualitative feedback. That's something we can also like create an issue and start talking about too, because like we were going to use Pendo for that, but we made the decision that we're not going to use the guides feature, which was like mechanism that allows us to pop up like a modal and like ask questions. So that's back on the table. So we need to figure out that problem and others. So yeah, I would just feel free to create issues for these, and then we can start talking about how to solve them.
Okay, we'll do.
All right, brother. Good chat, man. Feel free to like keep DMing me if there's more things I can help with. But there's a lot of interesting problems to solve, and looking forward to tackling them with you, man.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
All right, man. Thanks for the chat. See ya.